Board of Education. In accordance with the State Sunshine Law of New Jersey, adequate notice of this meeting of the Hillsborough Township Board of Education was provided on November 4th, 2021 to the Hillsborough Beacon and the Courier News. Mr. Mahmood, may we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Gillette?
Here.
Mr. Kidd?
Here.
Mr. Marini?
Present.
Mrs. Maroon?
Here.
Mrs. Nurse?
Here.
Mr. Oliver? Mr. Pulsifer?
Here.
Mrs. Stats?
Here.
And Ms. Trujillo?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahmood. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Vincent DeLucia from the New Jersey School Boards Association for board training tonight. And take it away.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I get a little confused this time of day. Quite frankly, it's that transition time. I'm Vince DeLucia. I know I've met some of you, and I hope to meet others of you at our further trainings. But what we have in front of you tonight is really a PowerPoint. You all will have copies of this. And in the interim, what I'd like to do is begin with, say, have a little bit of idea of who I am and really kind of what my interests are as an entrance. And I've been an educator for a long time. However, in my other time, I enjoy history, photography, and music, and my family. And those are just some photos I've taken over the last many years, actually. The top two photos are from Watley Beach, just north of Seaside. On the bottom left is the World Trade Center as it was being constructed many years ago. And on the right is Bruce Springsteen. And my sons, my wife, and I have seen Bruce about 55 times, and we're still counting, quite frankly. We're going to be talking tonight about inherent bias. And the title of the program is Deliberate. And it's deliberate because we have no control over our biases until we identify them. I also want to give you an idea of my educational background, a little bit of my resume. I spent 34 years in public schools. I've done a lot of professional development over my career. I also had a small business, and I also was the mayor of South Brunswick at one time, many years ago. And I raised that because, public officials today are under fire at different times. And unfortunately so, regardless of what our beliefs are. In my time, it was about preserving land. It was about saving farms. It was about having a decent economy. But you also notice the last line on there. There also was corruption. And to make a long story short, an investigation that I initiated with the feds led to the guilt of the aide to the then Senate President of the state of New Jersey for attempting to bribe me. Now, I say that not because of that, but because when you take a position sometimes, you're marked. What does that mean? My home was broken into 4 times. Nothing was ever stolen. They would go through my briefcase. For 2 years, they took my garbage every week. The FBI was in the window watching them. They were trying to get something on me to have me change my positions. So what I'm suggesting to you, that as public servants, be it elected or selected, there are a lot of pressures that you are on. And I understand them. But what does work is a focus on the issues and a focus on the facts and honoring discussions. And I say that this evening because that's also the way I conduct my professional learning, if you've been with me before, is that this is meant to be an open dialogue. This is not meant to be a lecture at all. So I do ask you to interrupt. I do ask you to ask questions, and I will honor your time as well. I also believe it's very important that we have a reason for what we do. As volunteers, or even if you have a paid position, there are a lot of times that you're out at night. You're away from your family or your friends or the things that you enjoy doing in your spare time. Oftentimes, it's thankless. For me, throughout my career, I focused on my North Stars. Those late night meetings or those meetings that made no sense. Be it my kids when they were younger, or today it's my grandkids. And I say that specifically as well because I do want to share a couple little things. One of which is that on the lower right is my granddaughter. She's in 1st grade. She was diagnosed at 2 as being on the spectrum. We were told she would never speak. Well, she speaks. And although she's maybe a year behind, I'm good with it because now she's reading. So what I'm suggesting is because of a Board of Education that was devoted to every kid in the district, because of phenomenal educators, be it certificated or not certificated. And I will say I have a lot of pride in my son and his wife, because they have done phenomenal things with Gia, as well as Nick, who is their other child. Now, the Iowa School Boards Association suggests that when you're doing this work, there are certain things that we should do ahead of time. And one of the things is to talk about how we got involved with, in this case, fairness and inherent bias, et cetera. For me, it was part of the family business. That's my father. My father was an urban educator before the term was even coined. The city of Hackensack, as you can see, in 1954, despite being in a diverse city, the classes were not diverse. That school was actually closed in the early 60s, became part of Hackensack High School, so that they could then redistrict, build another school, and really have classes that were more reflective of that community in that city. But what we're truly talking about this evening, ladies and gentlemen, we have to prepare our kids for their futures and not our pasts. And everything we do has to be in that lens. The preparation that I went through decades ago, that many of you went through more recently, is still strong. It's a foundation. But we're preparing kids for a different world. Not just from a point of technology, but from the point of we have an evolving and fortunately diversifying society. Now, when we think about in those terms, what are the things, the skills that the experts, quote unquote, say kids will need, kids today in school will need to be successful in their careers? According to both Fortune magazine, the National Education Association, and others who have done this work, kids who are graduating today and tomorrow need to feel and understand empathy. They need to be able to relate to other people and their situations. Now, why is that important? Because in our world, there are very few jobs that are done in isolation. Overwhelmingly, we work in teams, we work collaboratively. So not only do we have to have empathy, but our kids need to be able to collaborate, to critically think, and to be creative. When I talk to my grandson and I start telling him about his various traits, if I leave out creativity, I get smacked down, as I should be, because it is that important and that our kids need to believe in themselves in that way. And the third one is communication. But it's not just talking or writing. It's about how we form our messages. See, the research is clear. If we tell things in a story, kids remember, people remember, because we make connections in our brains. So today, we need to communicate effectively, use multi means of doing so, and do it in a way which is strategic, so that those hearing the message will truly understand and remember it. And our nation, we are changing, as we have been since the first settlers came. But we look at our census, the most recent one, and we compare it to the last two, we also see that we are well on the way to becoming a minority-majority nation. As a matter of fact, since 2015, there have been 50 metropolitan areas around the country, from Boston to Texas to California, 50 cities and areas that are minority-majority. Since 2019, total population of those states are minority-majority. 2020, since that time, under 18. Our nation is a minority-majority nation. which means that our elementary schools nationally today, our middle schools, our high schools, K to 12, is a majority population. What does that also mean? That by 2041, based on the statistics, our country will be a minority nation. It speaks to the need for all of us to have an understanding of each other, and all of us to have an understanding of how our inherent biases are formed, because we are victims of them. It's the brain, literally. We'll get to that in a few moments. But I also want to distinguish between equality and equity. There's a lot of misconceptions. We're not talking about equality in terms of our Constitution in this case. We're talking about equality or equity in our interventions and how we assist people, our kids, etc. You see, in the top row, there was no thought about differentiation. In the top row, if you notice, everybody got the same size bike, even if they didn't need it. Even if they didn't need it. But we're talking about equity. What's equity? Equity is giving the very specific interventions a person needs, a differentiated instruction, etc., that someone needs to be successful. We don't give everybody eyeglasses because one person has them. We give them to those who need that type of assistance. As you can see in that bottom row, each individual has a bike that's designed to help them succeed. And that is what equity is, nothing more, nothing less. It's ensuring that the appropriate tools are available for our learners, our staff, our families, etc. And I'm going to tell you a true story. It's about 6 years old. Happened in Berkeley, California high school. It's the first day of school. It was an AP physics class. As juniors and seniors entered the class, the teacher sitting on the desk, greeting each kid individually. However, for each student of color, the teacher asked to see their schedule. He didn't ask anybody else's schedule. He did not do it in a mean way. He had no malintention. But his inherent bias was, and it's very similar. You're going to see data from across the country, and you're going to see data from my last district, North Brunswick Township. What you're going to see is that adults, people in general, make assumptions based on their inherent biases. And unless we teach them, I take that back, unless they discover through means what their biases are, they will continue those biases, those behaviors. So what did he do? Was it prejudice? It was not prejudice. It was not racism. They're very different concepts. Those are concepts that are intentional. This is not an intentional act. He was just having conversation, and he was influenced by inherent biases. Now, inherent bias has something that leads into something else, and they're called microaggressions. Now, microaggressions are not physical things, they are verbal things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them in a few moments. But what they are the results of our inherent biases. So, I can't emphasize enough. Implicit bias does not equal racism or prejudice. Overt racism is a conscious decision. Implicit, explicit, implicit bias is not. However, when we become aware of our inherent biases, and I mean each one individually, not in mass, if we do not modify our behaviors and attitudes, that is when they become prejudice. There's a big difference. Now, this slide is literally, a message is 3 years old. You may recall in the fall, early fall of 18, a Starbucks in Philadelphia had an incident that led to them closing all of their Starbucks stores for a full day to do professional learning for their staff, to ensure that all customers and employees and others were treated with fairness and dignity. Because you see, implicit bias It impacts all parts of our society. Now, when I started doing this research and started doing this work over 10 years ago, I had a misconception. My misconception was that I was going to be talking about race, ethnicity, or spirituality. And it goes a lot deeper than that. The NBA did a study between 1991 and 04. They assessed the way officials were calling fouls in the NBA. What they learned, there was inherent bias in the way fouls were being called. This was not conscious decisions on the part of the referees. It was because of unfiltered information that they had that impacted their decisions. You may recall this is the one on the left is from South Jersey. In 2019 state tournament, a wrestler in Buena, New Jersey was going to be eliminated from the state tournament after wrestling for 2 months because he had dreadlocks. The photo there is the team trainer cutting his dreadlocks. His choice was he wanted to participate in the state tournament. Right before he was going to wrestle, he had his dreads cut. What resulted? Well, the NJSIAA, the Interscholastic Association that oversees athletics in the state of New Jersey, they determined, as have others, that our officials, interscholastic officials, needed training in inherent bias and anti-bias training. So for 2 years, which ended this past June 30th, to officiate in New Jersey at the interscholastic level, every one of those officials took a training in bias. On the other side, that's just from the spring from North Carolina, female softball player. You can see she has beads in her hair. The umpire told her she had to remove the beads or cut her hair because the beads were interfering with his being able to see the number 6 on her back. I don't think so. And I'm not also going to criticize the umpire, because unless that umpire has had the benefit of training, he or she, and I don't know who it was, he or she is as much of a victim as that player. So what happened was the NJSIA, they actually joined with the NFL in order to do that training over the last 2 years. And it's something that hopefully is one of those steps forward, because we always want to make forward progress. Food and nutrition. This is from a journal. I'm not a dietitian by any means. I know how to eat. However, what this is about is how to help parents whose kids are picky eaters and how to teach them to be intuitive eaters. Well, the only thing that's being suggested is to have a variety of foods that kids can choose from that are healthy. But it ignores the fact that in some areas, primarily urban areas, having access to fresh produce at all or at a reasonable price is challenging. So instead of having other alternatives, and this is again over a year old, this is from 2020. So instead of having other alternatives, there was only one pathway. Well, as we know as educators and as board members, there is seldom one pathway to teach kids. This is from 2018, Harvard. We've heard a lot about more direct bias and prejudice in our Asian American community. Well, there are other factors which you need to understand. And we need to understand these factors so that we can share them with the other adults in our district or world that are working with kids. Because Harvard consistently rated Asian American applicants lower than others on traits like positive personality, likability, courage, kindness, and being widely respected. And the third point, Asian musicians at the graduate level who are applying to Harvard If they only submitted an audio tape, they had a better chance of being accepted than if the audio tape was accompanied by a video, because there was a perceived lack of emotion on the video. Bias. And regardless of the stereotype, negative or positive and negative stereotypes negatively impact those groups of individuals, because they're unrealistic expectations if they're positive, and they're unfair if they're negative. This one's close to me. As I said, my granddaughter's on the spectrum. If you are a female, you are less likely to be diagnosed at an earlier age. And we know that the magic cutoff is the age of 3. After the age of 3, it becomes increasingly difficult to intervene successfully to kids on the spectrum. Now, why? The why is the media, but not in a negative way. The media portrays those on the spectrum frequently on TV shows, movies, but almost exclusively they are males. So the media, in our minds, we're seeing males as being autistic, but then there's the other piece as well, that females are able to mask their quote-unquote symptoms. That's a horrible word, but what they're able to do is they're better to analyze the behaviors of others and repeat those behaviors. So what's happening today in their mid-30s and older, there are more and more females who are being diagnosed as being on the spectrum, but they're going for assistance for anxiety and depression. The anxiety and depression has been shown to lead directly to their being on the spectrum and trying to deliberately behave and think before they act in each way. Artificial intelligence, love it. It's biased. These are just some of the headlines. Why are they biased? 2 reasons. One of which is humans are programming them. But the other is this, our smartphones, our technology is able to teach itself. And what's happening is that when our technology is learning about the images of different people, overwhelmingly, the images that are seen of women are not in professional settings. They are in domestic settings. So because they are teaching themselves, but they're teaching themselves with errored or flawed images, the result is not what we want it to be. Bias in healthcare, fewer cardiovascular interventions, fewer renal transplants, more likely to die after being diagnosed with breast cancer, less likely to be prescribed a pain med, less likely to receive chemotherapy, more likely to be blamed. All stats from the AMA and related places. Now the why. It's our brain's fault. It truly is. Our brain is constantly making connections. It's trying to seek patterns. It's trying to make sense of things. But there's only so much we can absorb. Throughout the day, every day, since you were born, essentially, 11 million bits of information are being bombarded at your brain per second. 11 million bits. The conscious mind can only interpret 40 to 50. Now, what does that mean? The other 10 million bits are stored in our memory banks. When we're making a decision, we see a conversation, we see something going on, and we're trying to make sense of it, our brains are literally making connections with information that's never been filtered or interpreted. But yet it goes into our memory banks and it comes out as whatever our decision, whatever our thoughts are at that moment. That is the basis for inherent bias. You'll see something in a few moments from researchers saying, no way should we be demonizing people for their inherent biases. Of course, unless we do the right thing and do the work and identify them, and we'll talk about that as well. So this is a part of this conversation which I dread, quite frankly. There's a nervous smile behind my mask. Why? Well, if I'm going to have any credibility with you, I really need to share with you something that bothered me for many years, and it really is an example of my inherent bias. So way back, some of you may recall Hurricane Andrew way back in the early 90s, South Miami. It was devastating. Well, that camper is a picture of a camper my family and I used, went all over this country. And that summer, we went to the Southeast, and then we decided to go down to the Miami area to see family. We were there a few days, and I kept hearing about this hurricane coming. Well, I realized it was time to go north. You know, who knew what the devastation could be? And it was a good decision. So on a Tuesday night, I think it was, we left Dade County about 7:30 at night, driving up Route 95, coming back to New Jersey. If you've ever driven 95, it's a great road. At night, there's not one light. There's no street lights. So about 5 miles from an exit going north, that tire literally blew. It was about 2:30 in the morning. I pulled off to the side of the road on the shoulder. It had to be changed. I looked at my surroundings. I knew it wasn't safe. So I figured, let me drive to the next exit. There's got to be one of those big truck stops, Love's, one of those places. Maybe take a shower or whatever now. So we drive about 5 miles, pull off the road. There was a service station, not a truck stop. The area was a nice big plot of land. It was dark. It was open. The service station looked like it came out of the Twilight Zone, quite frankly. I could even hear the tweaking of the sign. So I pulled off to the side. It was open. I did not want to be in the way. I detached the trailer, jacked it up. When I went to take the tire off, I literally needed a ½ inch to clear the fender. ½ inch. Now it's about 3 o'clock. I was driving through. I really didn't want to hook this trailer back up. So I literally stood there like this when the door of the gas station opened. The door opened. I see these 2 men walk out. I look in the back seat of my car where my 2 kids are sleeping and where my wife is sitting in the front seat. And this is the most embarrassing thing I can tell you, folks, but the truth is, I thought of my family's safety for no valid reason, but the fact that I'm a big guy, 2 black African-American men about my size were coming out towards me. I had no reason to suspect anything. And I tell you in a very embarrassing way, I did think something else. So what they do, they came over, we said hello. They picked up the trailer so I could take the tire off, put it on, and goes on my way. I offered to pay them. They said, absolutely not, pay it forward. We exchanged some niceties and left. I mean, I tell you right now, I'm still embarrassed about it. I had worked in the city, in some of the roughest neighborhoods. Never had a second thought. But that evening I did. Well, folks, I asked you to think about the impact that my behavior put me back in the classroom. What would my behavior have had the effect on parents or kids if when kids of color or parents of color came into my room? It would have a devastating effect. And I submit to you, you're going to hear other data that with the untrained eye, that is what's happening. Nobody's fault. No one is doing it intentionally. When I had those thoughts that night in South Carolina, they were not intentional thoughts. I was a victim of what had been unfiltered in my own mind. Now, you will all have a copy of this, by the way, tomorrow. This presentation is already in the district. I encourage you on your own to look up Harvard's Project Implicit. Why? It's a series of about 20 tests Each one takes 2 to 3 minutes on the computer. And what happens? You will get an assessment of what your inherent biases are. And don't forget, they can be positive or negative, but they're still a bias. These are most of the tests, most of the assessments for each of these areas that are assessed in that. And since you'll have a copy of this, I'm not going to read this, but I encourage you to ask yourself those questions, to reflect after you take these assessments. It is the best way for you to have an understanding. And as leaders of the district, it's the best way to be the exemplars, because we really want all the adults in our district to do this. And we also want to encourage our parents to do this. These are the other examples of inherent biases. Quite a few of them. At the end of the day, it's always about relationships. Kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. President Teddy Roosevelt said that, but he said people, which is obviously an expanded version. So I've talked about a little bit. Now let's think about those impacts. I showed you a list before. Look at this. There is a bias of low expectations. There is. There's a bias of low expectations according to the National Education Association and their polling of some 15,000 teachers. And there's a bias that I'm also going to share with you that was identified when 2 teachers at North Brunswick Township High School did a triangulated study about 13 years ago now, which demonstrated the exact same data that the national data reports. It's critical. If you're a coach, if you are an activity director, if you teach music, if you're an academic teacher or a special teacher, it's critical that our kids know that we believe in them. That's the number one factor that can impact the kid in a very easy way, positive or negatively. If not, we've all heard those, well, I did at least growing up, people will always meet the bar of expectations. If we challenge them realistically, it's healthy. If we don't challenge them at all, it's an insult. And if we don't believe in them, we're doing both. Research. Does my teacher believe in me? This is going to be reflected in the local data. Teachers have lower expectations for Black and Latino students versus their white peers. The same thing holds true when kids are taking their tests or doing their work. Many of them are thinking, does this teacher, does this adult believe in me? And it impacts them. This is from a few months ago, PISA, an international test. You know, right now, over the last several months in New Jersey in particular, but across the country, as schools are on this pathway back to hopefully normalcy at some point, there's been a organized movement that we need to be advocating and emphasizing an asset mindset versus a deficit mindset. Where we are will contribute to our achievement and our growth. Well, here, 600,000 kids, 15-year-olds from 78 countries. The bottom line is in red. When compared to students who believe their intelligence is fixed, students with a growth mindset scored significantly higher on all subjects. And you can see what the numbers are. Of the kids in the United States, 70% reported a growth mindset. Does my teacher believe in me? Do my parents believe in me? Do I believe in me? The same thing holds true when it comes to behaviors, folks. Again, this is based on inherent biases. These are not conscious decisions that are being made. These are the adults as well as the kids are victims of inherent biases. This explains the perceptions that adults have based on their inherent biases on who's doing what in schools in terms of behavior, the escalation of those things, and that because there's the preconceived notion that our kids of color are more troublesome, well, the infractions then require harsher punishments in those worlds. All things that data will affirm, all things that can be addressed, and all things that are not being done deliberately. The bias of low expectations. It becomes a self-fulfilling behavior. When we label kids, they know the labels we have for them. You go into any school, kid A may be not the model student in class A. In class B, that student is the model student. What's the difference? Oftentimes it's the relationship between the teacher and the student. As a student that is accepting, is believing, and separates behaviors from the child. What does that mean? If we say that a kid who gets into a fight is a fighter, that's his label. If we say a good kid got into a fight, the label, he's a good kid. Changing the mindset changes everything for a child, for an adult. It's a human behavior. So we have three different types of implicit bias. We have three types of bias. We have explicit bias, which is prejudice. Suppressed thoughts are when we believe things, but we choose not to say them because we don't want to create a stir. Example, unfortunately, my wife is a cigarette smoker. Never have been. We go out with friends. She doesn't want our friends to know that she's still smoking her cigarettes. It's something we don't talk about. It's a suppressed thought. Implicit bias is what we've been talking about now. If you notice, explicit and suppressed thoughts are conscious behaviors. Implicit is an unconscious behavior. And they oftentimes lead into microaggressions. These are not physical acts. These are comments that are made, the way we treat people, verbal or nonverbal. They fall into three categories: insults, assaults, and invalidations. If you notice, an assault, again, we're talking about essentially unintentional, unconscious behaviors. An assault is after telling an anti-Semitic joke, the speaker says, "Oh, I was just kidding." It doesn't really cut it. An insult, commenting that, or implying, I should say, a comment implying that a woman received her job due to affirmative action. An invalidation, the AP physics teacher we talked about at the beginning. Every kid in that class belonged in there. He only asked kids of color because of his inherent bias. I'm not going to read these. These are some of the examples in our society or in schools of ways that microaggressions appear. As an administrator in two different districts in Middlesex County, one of the things that bothered me always was when my colleagues didn't really practice all the names of their kids at things like graduation and mispronounced a name. The one time, or one of a few times, that a kid is center stage and we didn't get it right. Is it on purpose? No. But the emotional impact for that kid or his family is still the same. Words matter. I mentioned an NEA study, 16,000 teachers were interviewed. They talked to both black and non-black teachers, asking who would graduate from high school, who would graduate from college. You can see what the result is. When asked about any specific black student, non-black teachers were 30% less likely than a black teacher to predict a specific black kid would someday earn a college degree. For white kids, it was about the same. That's national stuff. I'm going to talk to you about North Brunswick soon. The data is the same. Now, what's important is this. This is out of Seth, out of American University. If nothing else, we should not be demonizing or implicating teachers in this setting or just the adults in general, because these are not intentional acts. What we need to do is provide professional learning and that support structure so we can change the climate through education. Ohio State's Kirwan Institute, very similar. Implicit bias may influence a teacher's expectations for success. If you notice that there are two different studies, meta-analysis, holding lower expectations, either implicitly or explicitly, for African American or Latino kids when compared to European American or Asian children. We need to have high expectations for all kids. Realistic, not the same one, differentiated, but we need to have high expectations for all. The consequences of implicit bias are real. It robs people of compassion for making connections to victims. It makes some people feel defensive when they should not be defensive. They didn't do anything. What did we do? Our brains did it, and we haven't done the work yet to understand it. Every year, it takes about 5 years. I'm still waiting for this year's to come out, or for the most recent one. This is from a year ago, so the next one coming out will be the 16-17 school year. This is the number of instructional days lost per 100 kids per 180 school year. The two I bring to your attention, the second one in from the left are black kids, 103 days, and all the way at the end are special ed kids, 68 days. It's a lot of days lost. How many of those were, yeah?
What do you mean by lost? Instructional days lost?
Means that they were out of school.
Oh, they're out.
They were suspended. So they didn't get a day of learning.
Oh, suspension?
Yeah, suspensions. Yeah. Now, the good news is that every state is making improvements. So I don't want to leave you with the impression it's not being addressed, because it is. The questions become, and that's not this is not a specific comment, it's the general comment that each district has to reflect on. How effectively are they doing it? And each district has its own results. This is just from a few weeks ago. Latino students misdiagnosed with learning disabilities, et cetera. When I got to North Brunswick Township, I should take that back. I was there. It has nothing to do with my there or not being there in North Brunswick. I want to make that clear. North Brunswick Township had a 22% classification rate for black males. 22%. It should be about 15 to 14%. Not uncommon. There was a corrective action plan from the DOE. It took several years in order to make those numbers more real. The classifications were made many times because of poor judgment and poor data. School to prison pipeline, I'm not going to get into the details, but there is a school to prison pipeline, we know that. But that's also why there are efforts in Middlesex County and Gloucester County by the prosecutors' offices to use social interventions, to use psychological interventions. Talk about that in a moment. Data, 220, the latest one for Education Week, 70% of school arrests enforcement are for black and Hispanic kids nationally. 3.5 times more likely suspended or expelled than white peers. That came out of that data. The same data came out of North Brunswick a few years ago. And the same thing is true in other cities. It's not one city, it's all over the place. Why? Because it's inherent bias. The belief that black kids were being suspended for zero tolerance policies does not ring true. The data doesn't support it. Because the most likely things were minor infractions like talking back. But this goes back to that escalation effect I spoke about a few moments ago, where the educators are assuming worse and they are more harsh in the way they address those issues. So it's a major contributing factor of disproportionality in our schools, from an academic viewpoint, as well as from a social emotional or student management viewpoint. This is work I'm sure it's going on in your district. It's just a matter of doing that analysis of who is classified and the rationale for it. As I mentioned before, in Gloucester, Middlesex County, they are trying to not use complaints at the prosecutor's office as long as the victim agrees. And that's a key statement. So, as I said several years ago, 2 teachers came to me. They told me, I was the assistant super in North Brunswick. They said, we have bias in our high school. They had done a triangulated study to demonstrate that. North Brunswick evolved very rapidly. In 1990, although this is the high school population, the district population is very similar. It was a 75% white district in 1990. At around the same time, New Brunswick went through urban renewal. They rebuilt New Brunswick Tomorrow, and they took down blocks and blocks of public housing. The good news is that other communities diversified. The bad news is it was done in a very rapid, unstructured way and caused a lot of stress on other communities who were not ready for the change. However, if you look at those data, North Brunswick has been a majority community for over 20 years now. Not only the high school, but the entire community. And you see where those numbers are in terms of 22, 25, 31, and 22% at the extreme right. So 2013, although the Black and Hispanic kids comprise 50% of the population, they're 80% of the referrals. And when you start looking at the numbers at the top, 3148 versus less than 1,000. There was bias in that, and I'll explain that soon too. But look at the special ed black kids at the top row, 28.1% suspension rates. Extraordinarily high. So what did North Brunswick do? In a very brief moment, a 5-year path of professional learning, a 5-year path to eliminate remedial classes at the high school, 45% poverty rate in that high school, and a directed belief that more kids could be, foundations is remedial. AP and honors, we know what they are. There was a belief that more kids of color could qualify for those CP, or just college prep or above classes. Remember I talked about the bias of low expectations? This is 250 staff at that high school. 66% said a white kid would take an AP class, 75% an Asian kid would. 0.4 or 1 staff member said that it was likely a Latino kid would. 0.8 or 2 said it was likely the black kid would. I'm not here to demonize or to criticize one adult in that building. I want to emphasize that. They were doing their best based on the tools they had at the time. When it came to basic skills, it was the reverse. 65% of black kid would, 67% of the Latino kid would, 7% said an Asian kid, 13% said a white kid would. The question always becomes, how many of those kids were put in those classes not because of academics, but for other reasons? So there was detracking over a 4-year period. We were successful. They had bridge classes. There are no remedial classes in the high school. Instead, what you can see, and I'm not going to get into the numbers, but you see increases in college prep and honors, not so much in honor and AP at that time. And the same thing was true in geometry. So through bridge classes, through concerted efforts, professional learning, parent academies, etc., a change was made. It's much more difficult to have the top leadership, the principals, be diversified. There just is not as many candidates. However, they've been able to do that. It was much easier, I mean that in a very positive way, for those sub-administrators to get experience and then move up. So yes, so the supervisors, the vice principals, etc., there was more of a diversification there. We're getting short on time, but these are some of the examples of their successes that continue today. And my partner, my former boss, Brian Zakowski, just retired as a superintendent. If there are needs to reach out, that's his contact information. And then Sid Dawson and Kane Ellis, they were the teachers who actually did this work. And really, they were the key people that started changes in North Brunswick by doing a study that they verified we had issues. These are just some of the things that you can and should look at. I'm sure you already do, quite frankly, when you look at your various reports. And I'm talking about the central office in particular. I'm sure they're doing this work already. Next steps is professional learning. It's parent academies. It's your board policy manual. You're entitled to have it checked for free by school boards to ensure that it's up to date and reflects current policy. Data review, the asset mindset, culture responsive teaching, a responsive classroom, PBSS, cooperative learning are all critical things for our kids. Again, with the data reports. And then finally, there are 4 ways that we can reduce bias. One is to cultivate an awareness of them. Taking those Harvard implicit bias assessments. Having difficult conversations about them as you're doing this evening. It's working to increase empathy. It's ensuring that our communications are empathetic. It's about looking at the data and acting on it where appropriate. Ways to increase our empathy, to practice mindfulness. And not only to develop cross-group friendships, but more importantly, our kids should see us talking to diverse people in the halls, etc., so that our kids see those exemplars and those models. So if you're human, you have biases. The question to ask ourselves is not do we have them, but which ones do we have? These are some readings that came out of the New Jersey School Boards Association Equity Council, as well as from the work being done in North Brunswick. And that really concludes my comments, and I encourage you to ask any questions or any comments at this time, too.
Thank you, Mr. DeLucia. I'll open it to the board now for any questions for Mr. DeLucia. Mr. Gillette.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm not sure I understand if you explained how the brain is doing this, how the brain is driving. I mean, you said a little bit about it, the 11 billion stimuli or whatever it is. Is it sort of looking at people as being in a group and using some stereotype to prejudge the person?
What it is initially is this, is that actually everything you hear or see is absorbed. That's what it is. So your brain is trying to make those connections. So I can't tell you what it's doing or specifically, but it's looking at whatever you're seeing or reading or hearing and trying to make connections to make sense of it, to interpret it. So some of that stuff is raw information, unfiltered, and some of it has been filtered or vetted.
So the brain is using racial or gender or some other type of stereotype to make a judgment?
I'm not going to use that term. It's using unfiltered information.
Why won't you use that term?
It's just not an appropriate term.
Why?
Mr. Gillette, if you want to talk about terms, there's no need to that. We're talking about a specific topic here. It's not about being a stereotype. It's about unfiltered information.
Okay. Why does unfiltered information lead to bias?
Well, if we have unfiltered information, that means we have not analyzed it. So if we analyze it through our lenses, and if our lenses also do include that type of a filter, then we have a better opportunity.
I think what you don't want to say is that we should be in this district and across this country judging people individually and not as part of groups. I think you don't want to say that for some reason. Why wouldn't you want to say that?
Mr. Gillette, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about this evening. Nothing at all. We're talking about the way people acquire biases. That's an individual issue that we're talking about.
Sure, I gotcha. I think individually, we should be judging others as individuals. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I would agree with that. But you're trying to take us down a pathway which I don't believe is fruitful. Because what we're trying to do here instead is to look at the information in an academic viewpoint. And it's not about stereotypes. It's not about the things that are conscious. It's about what's not conscious. It's about what has not been filtered, what's not been interpreted.
Wow.
Very different.
Can you recommend someone else that we could have speak that might dispute some of these findings of yours?
These are not my findings. This is research based on the research of others.
Is there anyone that disputes it?
Well, I will share this with you. I would suggest, no, I have not read anyone who is disputing what we're talking about.
I know
this evening.
Vox did a big story in 2017. You heard of Vox? Did a big story in 2017 saying that the IAT basically didn't work. Do you think that the IAT test is valuable and it works?
Let me put it this way. We know that we can always look and find those anomalies or find negative information. However, we also know that you're stating something that's unsupported.
What did I state that was unsupported?
You're quoting somebody else is saying something. It seems to me, quite
So
frankly.
are you.
No, I have the
Oh,
references there. Quite frankly, I'm not sure what your concern is. Maybe you could be a little more specific.
No, I'm done with you. Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Gillette. Ms. Nurse.
Just in terms of the research, you said a lot that it was subconscious, not conscious decisions. How was that measured in all of this research? Like, how did the researchers know that it was subconscious and not conscious decision-making?
I did not delve that into the research, quite frankly. We're just talking about the results.
Thank you, Ms. Nurse. Thank you, Mr. DeLucia. Mr. Oliver, and then Ms. Stats.
So just one question I had is, many of the data points you brought up, and I saw some dates from 1990 and 2000. I mean, that's old data.
The NBA was from 01 to 04.
I mean, the most recent data that I saw up there was 2017. That's still,
There was also 18 up there, but that's okay.
I mean, it's a different world today than it was 2017 or 1990. Like, is there any new data that we could look at?
I will be happy to furnish you with some, but quite frankly, it's the same data because it's not been addressed. Because what the other part of the data is that when it is addressed, then it doesn't become a bias anymore.
And then one other statement that you made in the study, which I found pretty interesting, was the ratio of female to male diagnosis in people with the autism. But yet the data shows that the autism gene is carried 4 times more, 4-to-1 ratio in males versus females. So is that data number skewed by that fact?
No, as I also suggested to you based on that same research, was that because females have the ability to analyze the behaviors of others and implement that behavior. And as it gets through time, they're being diagnosed as a secondary piece for autism, being on the spectrum. They're seeking help for anxiety and depression.
See, I don't see that data. I do a lot of work with autistic kids, and that data just, to me, that just makes no sense whatsoever.
You're entitled to that opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver, Ms. Stats. And we do have executive session coming up, so, and then Mr. Kidd.
One thing I just want.
Ms. Stats first.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just speaking from my own, personal anecdotal experience. Before I retired, I was a math teacher. Before I retired, a couple years before I retired, the New Jersey said that we had to eliminate non-college prep courses. And in retrospect, I don't know if that was to address the disproportionate number of Blacks and Latinos in non-college prep courses. Many of my colleagues and I were dismayed by that. It just seemed like an overly simplistic solution to that issue. And again, from my personal experience, and I don't want to throw anybody else under the bus, but a lot of my colleagues, we ended up lowering our standards in the college prep courses. And hopefully we weren't being biased towards anyone, but if we hadn't we would have had a lot more failures of kids of all genders, races, et cetera. So it just seemed like a overly simplistic, if not lazy solution to a problem. And that concerns me that we were disadvantaging, I don't know if I'm saying the right word, all of our students, instead of trying to address the
Two things, if
main
I
issue.
may. One of which is that there's a recognition, I believe, at the state level, that we need an increase in CTE classes. We need an increase in opportunities for kids to earn those credentials in high school. There's actually a commission which has just begun, appointed by the governor. It came out of one of our task force reports. There's a representative from ASA, the Superintendent's Association. There are 4 representatives from county and 4-year colleges in New Jersey, and there's a representative from the New Jersey School Boards Association. And what the movement is to have support structures for dual enrollment, not just for college credits, but also for CTE programs for next year. Getting back to your specific question, in that district, what they did was they had bridge classes so that there was a 4-year span to really ease kids into it. And then they continue to have differentiation and other support structures. I understand the position you were put in at that time, unfortunately.
Thank you. Mr. Kidd?
Oh, I just wanted to suggest to Mr. Oliver that I'm not sure if there is an autism gene, but if there is one that's seen as an autism gene, it is honestly much more likely to be seen as correlated rather than causated of autism symptoms. And so any implicit bias around diagnosis is going to impact how correlated that gene could be with autism, if you can see autism in people who don't have that gene that are female or male. So the validity of research regarding that is impacted by the implicit biases we're talking about here in terms of society, of how people are recommended for those diagnoses. Because if you have people who are women being recommended for possible diagnosis less than men, and there's a correlation seen among those men that there's this gene, then it impacts what is seen as the cause of autism. You get what I'm getting at?
No.
All right. Thank you very much for the comments to my board members, and to Mr. DeLucia, thank you very much for that
My pleasure.
presentation. Appreciate it very much.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
It is now 7:04, and we will take a motion to go into executive session.
So moved. Second.
Sorry, I was going to read it, but thank you. Whereas the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231 of the laws of 1975 provides that a public body may exclude the public from that portion of a meeting of which the public body discusses certain matters for which confidentiality is required, as permitted in Section 7B of the Act. Resolved by the Board of Education of the Township of Hillsborough in the County of Somerset in the State of New Jersey as follows. 1, the matters to be discussed are student disciplinary hearings and a settlement agreement. 2, the matters discussed in executive session shall be disclosed to the public when the need for confidentiality no longer exists. And may I have a motion in a second?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Marini.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. All in favor?
Aye.
We are now in executive session. We expect to be back at 7:30. Thank you. And welcome back. We are back now from executive session. Apologies for the delay. Mr. Mahmood, may we please have a roll call?
Mr. Gillette?
Here.
Mr. Kidd?
Here.
Mr. Marini?
Present.
Mrs. Maroon?
Just step down.
Okay. Mrs. Nurse?
Here.
Mr. Oliver? Here. Mr. Pulsifer?
Here.
Mrs. Stats?
Here.
And Ms. Trujillo?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. May we now please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the correspondence as listed and give, and then go into committee reports. And actually, before we begin, I would just like to remind board members, and welcome to Ms. Fofana, if you could speak into the microphone when you're speaking so that the audio recording can pick up. Since I'll actually start with Ms. Stats, if you don't mind, with the Municipal Alliance report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. The Municipal Alliance met on October 15th, and we obviously discussed a variety of issues, one of which was the Young Adult Support Group. Four people signed up for the series of meetings, but only 2 showed up. And we are committed to trying to address the needs of that population. There was also a pre-football game ceremony regarding Red Ribbon Week that the Municipal Alliance attended on Friday, October 15th. There were reports by the high school SAT counselors regarding, they were concerned about uptick in anxiety and social issues, but the students are glad to be back in school. Several in-person programs have been put on hold, but they're looking forward to when visitors are allowed in the building so that they can make these presentations. And that's about it. Thank you, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Ms. Stats. Ms. Maroon, if you would give the education report. Thank you.
Sure. So the education meeting occurred on November 3rd. You see a bunch of it that is on the agenda for tonight is the AP Computer Science, which is a new course that we discussed. There's book adoptions that are listed on the agenda, and the nursing service plan that we, again, is also, you can see it on the agenda. A number of items were also discussed. We discussed class sizes in the high school, online courses, and we also moved the disposal of textbooks to November 22nd. We discussed emails and misleading information about respondents to emails. We also started our discussion on the calendar for 2022-2023, and we also were provided update on the academic teams competing.
Thank you, Ms. Maroon. Are there any questions on the committee reports before we open it up to the public? Okay, seeing none, then I will now open the public comment for items on tonight's action agenda only. Oh, sorry. There was no, we did, but there's no, we didn't. It's next, tomorrow. There was no minutes. There's no minutes. No minutes. Oh, that's okay. So we will now open it up for public comment on the action agenda only. We very much welcome input from the public. During board meetings, there will be 2 30-minute periods of time that the meeting will be open for public comment, where members of the public are invited to comment, which they may do so if they're attending in person. During the first public comment period, members of the public may comment about items that are listed on tonight's agenda before the board votes. During the second public comment period, members of the public may comment on any school or school district issue that a member of the public feels may be of concern to the residents of the district as per bylaw 167. Before you state your comment, you will be asked to provide your name and address. There is a 3-minute time limit on public comment. Please understand that our public forums are not structured as question and answer sessions, but rather are offered as opportunities to share your thoughts with the board. In instances where the board believes that there is a misunderstanding or inaccuracy, the board president or superintendent will address the comment. There may be times when a member of the public makes a comment or asks a question about personnel or hiring decisions. Kindly note that the Open Public Meetings Act and the privacy rights of public employees encompassed therein do not permit the board to discuss personnel issues in public session. And if anybody is planning to make a public comment, if you would please spell your name for the record to allow for the easier taking of the minutes. Thank you. Okay, seeing no comments on the public agenda, I will now close public comment on the public, on the action agenda and turn it over to the superintendent. Oh, sorry, I will now open it up for the board comment. Ms. Stats.
Sorry, I didn't use the earlier opportunity, but I am still concerned. When we talked about class size in the Education Committee, I was concerned about the, lots of class sizes that were in the high 20s or 30 plus in the high school. And in third and fourth grades, there are some class sizes that are 25, 26 students. And I'm disappointed that that was not addressed as far as, it was not resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stats. Any other comment from the board? Okay, seeing none, then I will turn it over to the superintendent for the action agenda.
Thank you, Mrs. Trujillo. We are going to start with the superintendent recommends a motion to affirm the October 25th, 2021 agenda. If you recall, we canceled that meeting. So I'll start with that one and then.
May I have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Thank you, Mr. Kidd. Oh, Mr. Marini, thank you. Any discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Mahmood, if we could have a roll call?
Mr. Gillette,
Yes.
Mr. Kidd,
Yes.
Mr. Marini,
Yes.
Mrs. Maroon,
Yes.
Mrs. Nurse,
Yes.
Mr. Oliver,
Yes.
Mr. Pulsifer,
Yes.
Mrs. Stats,
Yes.
and Ms. Trujillo.
Yes.
Motion passed.
Thank you. The superintendent recommends that the Board of Education approve the education agenda as follows. Motion to approve travel-related expenses, the affiliation agreement with RVCC, the motion to approve the fiction books as listed, motion to approve the 2021-2022 nursing services plan, motion to accept the safety grant funds. That's education.
Thank you. May I have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Marini. Thank you, Ms. Nurse. Ms. Nurse, thank you. Any discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Mahmood, if we could have a roll call?
Surely. Mr. Gillette,
Yes.
Mr. Kidd,
Yes.
Mr. Marini,
Yes.
Mrs. Maroon,
Yes.
Mrs. Nurse,
Yes.
Mr. Oliver,
Yes.
Mr. Pulsifer,
Yes.
Mrs. Stats,
Yes.
and Mrs. Trujillo.
Yes.
Motion passed.
Thank you. The superintendent recommends that the Board of Education approve the human resources agenda as follows, 10.1 to 10.14. Motion to approve retirements and resignations, and I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Bidoff, teacher of fifth grade Alton Road, who's been with us since 2003. Motion to approve transfer, change in assignments as listed, as well as the revised leaves of absence. Motion to approve a revised leave replacement teacher and revised bus aid hours. Motion to approve the revised mentor. Motion to rescind a contract. Motion to approve leaves of absences as listed, as well as appointments. Motion to approve a student teacher. To approve our turnkey trainers for the school year. Motion to approve 6-period coverage and pre-approve extra coverage. And motion to approve extra coverage.
Thank you. May I have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver.
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Maroon. Any discussion? Ms. Stats?
Just want to express my, I guess congratulations to Ms. Uhas, but also disappointment because she is a strong special education teacher. So it'll be a loss for our district, but I wish her luck.
Thank you, Ms. Stats. Any other comments? Seeing none, if we could have a roll call, Mr. Mahmood?
Surely. Mr. Gillette,
Yes.
Mr. Kidd,
Yes.
Mr. Marini,
Yes.
Mrs. Maroon,
Yes.
Mrs. Nurse,
Yes.
Mr. Oliver,
Yes.
Mr. Pulsifer,
Yes.
Mrs. Stats,
Yes.
and Ms. Trujillo.
Yes.
Motion passed.
The superintendent recommends that the Board of Education approve the operations agenda as follows, 11.1 to 11.5. Motion to approve an agreement for participation in coordinated transportation services for the 2021-2022 school year. Motion to approve the out-of-district placement and a settlement agreement as listed. Motion to accept the donations and approve the bylaws and policy for first reading as listed.
Thank you. May I have a motion and a second?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Marini.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Gillette. Any discussion? Okay, I just wanted to point out that on the bylaws 143 and 167, they were discussed in governance last week. And the 143 is just to align with our election of board officers. And then 167 is part of a discussion that will, the other part of board meetings is in 164, which will be discussed in a future governance committee meeting and hopefully brought to the floor. So we had a first and a second. Oh, Mr. Marini?
Yeah, quick question. This is, I think, for Mr. Gillette. You may know better than anybody else. I raised a question during one of our sessions about bylaws. Are we prescribed to do 2 readings of something that's mandated by the state? So I think the question was, we always do the first reading, second reading. Are we required to do both?
Yes.
Even
Yeah,
if it's
because it has to be,
It's through your bylaws, yeah.
No, all right. So if we amended the bylaws, do we have, it just seems a little bit of a waste of time if it's mandated by the state to go through 2. Or even
Oh,
have a vote.
that's a good, if our bylaws didn't require us to have 2 readings, could we only have 1? Would that be permitted?
I think it could be done. I don't know of anyone that does that. I don't know of any board that does that. I think all the boards typically will do 2 readings. Which is typical because you do the first reading, you see if there's any comments, you see if there's any revisions, and then you have a second reading.
But for something that doesn't, it's from the state, can it even have revisions?
Yes, there are some that, like, if you get policies either from, for example, New Jersey School Boards or Strauss Esme, one of those policy services, they often will tell you this is a mandated policy and you need to enact it, but there's often choices that you have in terms of what you can and can't do. There's certain minimum levels that you have, but there are other things that you can choose to do or not choose to do. So sometimes that 2 reading structure is helpful to tease out those issues.
Okay, I was just asking for a simplification and reduction of unnecessary
Sure.
steps, but if it's required, so be it.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Marini. Any other discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Mahmood, if we get a roll call.
Sure. Mr. Gillette?
Yes.
Mr. Kidd?
Yes.
Mr. Marini?
Yes.
Mrs. Maroon?
Yes.
Mrs. Nurse?
Yes.
Mr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Pulsifer?
Yes.
Ms. Stats?
Yes.
And Ms. Trujillo?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Mr. Mahmood. And now I'd like to turn it back to the superintendent for the superintendent's report.
Thank you. I'd like to start my report by welcoming everyone back after a nice long weekend. The weather certainly cooperated with everybody. Fall is no doubt here, and winter seems right around the corner, as evidenced by the frost on our windows. I would also like to take a moment to remind parents and students that for families that may have traveled last week or have travel plans for the upcoming holidays, please be aware of quarantine requirements for our unvaccinated students. Travel includes anywhere outside New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware. Quarantine is 7 to 10 days. If a student tests negative 3 to 5 days after travel, they are required to quarantine for 7 days. If a student does not get tested, they are required to quarantine for 10 days. If a student tests positive, they must stay home for 10 days after the positive test. The district continues to follow the CDC guidelines for travel. Please cooperate with these guidelines. Although we all look forward to the loosening and relaxing of restrictions, we must remain vigilant, keeping our schools open full day, 5 days a week, and the health and safety of our unvaccinated students must remain our first priority. I've received quite a bit of feedback on the decision not to allow public participation at fall performances. Again, I request that parents, students, and staff remember that we knew as we opened schools in September that the priority was to keep schools open. Unfortunately, with this in mind, it was also shared that it was a possibility that not all activities would be able to resume their typical procedures. I continue to collaborate with the local health officials and our school physician on these decisions. As noted in the COVID dashboard shared with the community, we still continue to see an increase of COVID-19 cases after extended days off from school or following holidays. I expect to see this trend through the upcoming holiday season. Folks, make no mistake. We carry the weight of every decision we make each and every day for 1,400 staff members and 7,300 students. We know that these decisions do not make everyone happy, and I understand that while it may seem inconsistent and may be inconsistent, every situation is looked at individually. There may be inconsistencies. However, there is consistency in trying to ensure everyone is safe. We've also been consistent in the promise to reevaluate and adjust decisions as time moves forward, and we've done so. Discussions I have had with the New Jersey Department of Health, local Department of Health, district physician, et cetera, indicate that their predictions for an increase in the number of COVID patients will continue throughout the holiday season before stabilizing during the winter. These are decisions that I'm happy to spend time with because it means we're in school. However, if we don't remain vigilant and we allow the process and don't allow the process to unfold based upon the situation at the moment of decision making, then school will close and we won't have to worry about making these decisions. And I don't believe that's what anyone wants. Nevertheless, as additional information is provided, we'll continue to share the decisions. The decisions are made at the time that information is presented. That changes daily. At this time, I'd like to announce that we have agreed to approve academic teams to participate in in-person competitions. However, all health and safety guidelines must be followed. And by that, I mean all Hillsborough Township health and safety guidelines must be followed. If a school that our students are attending has a less restrictive guideline, they are to follow Hillsborough's guidelines, not the school's guidelines. Due to the tenuous nature of procuring adequate transportation for all off-site extracurricular events, waivers may be necessary for transportation to some competitions. The district is not authorizing any overnight trips at this time. Let me say that again. We are not authorizing any overnight trips at this time. As shared in today's COVID-19 dashboard update, I'd like to share that the Hillsborough Township Health Department, in conjunction with Greenbrook Family Medicine, is holding a vaccination clinic for 5 to 11-year-olds on Sunday, November 14th. The clinic will be held at Hillsborough High School from 9 to 1. To ensure adequate supplies, registration is required. School districts across the state have been asked to host and share information surrounding vaccination sites. This request goes through the same process as any other facility usage requests, including need for insurance things and things like that from whoever's hosting it. Hosting a vaccination clinic does not speak to the board's or district's endorsement of vaccination or vaccination status. That's an individual decision. This is the utilization of a public building in the midst of a public health crisis. It is a pleasure to announce that 2 Hillsborough High School students, Vanya Medina and Elizabeth LeBouf, were selected out of 350 applicants to represent Hillsborough High School as members of the New Jersey All-State Chorus. Membership was extremely competitive as each voice part only accepted the top 18 scoring individuals. Both students sing soprano too and will represent Hillsborough High School at live performances in November and February. Congratulations to the Raider Marching Band, who are in first place, claiming the U.S. Band State Championship for their division on October 30th with their 2021 show, The Haunted. The band earned the highest score out of all the bands in attendance across all divisions. As a result of the impacts on students due to the pandemic, the New Jersey Department of Education is awarding the district funds to support student learning and mental health. We are seeking public input on the utilization of funds to mitigate the impacts the pandemic has had on schools and students' academic, social, emotional, and mental health. Please visit the website beginning tomorrow. Actually, I think it's already up there because we've gotten some input to provide input on identifying specific needs in our community and providing ideas on how these funds could help resolve them. Finally, on behalf of the Board of Education, as we commemorate Veterans Day this Thursday, November 11th, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to our military veterans who have served in the United States Armed Forces. If you haven't already had the opportunity to drive by the Township Municipal Complex, please take a moment to drive by and view the Field of Honor display of American flags as part of the Flags for Heroes initiative sponsored by the Rotary Club of Hillsborough. It's truly a beautiful sight. There's a Veterans Day ceremony at the Garden of Honor on Thursday, November 11th at 6 p.m. Thank you, Ms. Trujillo.
Thank you, Dr. Antunes. And I would just like to make a note to the board that and a reminder that the negotiated agreement between the Hillsborough Education Association and the Board of Education runs through June 30th, 2022. And as per NJSBA timeline recommendations, the board will begin planning for negotiations. And I'd like to announce that the negotiation committee members will be Mr. Pulsifer, who will be the chair, Ms. Stats, Mr. Gillette, and myself to begin the process. And I would like to turn it over to the board for any comments. Mr. Marini.
Yes, so this was announced via communicated email. I just wanted to say that I'm disappointed. And this is not a comment on the abilities of the individuals included, but we do have 2 members on this negotiation committee that did not run for election and are not going to be on as of January. So it does not seem like a responsible choice to knowingly have only about a month left before the terms end to bring in individuals who will not be on the board, most likely to see this to closure. you can't assume that this is going to be addressed in about a month's time.
Thank you, Mr. Marini, for your comments. I do appreciate your thoughts and sharing your thoughts on that. As we discussed earlier, just between us, that I had reasons, I thought about this very carefully, and the points that you brought up are good ones, they're valid. I think that on balance, the reason I chose Mr. Gillette and Ms. Stats, who will not be with us on the board next year, Mr. Gillette and myself will, is that I feel like the four are the strongest to start. Mr. Gillette, go ahead. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
You're being removed.
I apologize. I apologize. Mr. Pulsifer and Ms. Stats. I'm sorry. I apologize, Mr. Gillette. So I felt that this was the strongest. I'm sorry, Mr. Pulsifer. All right, Ms. Nurse.
I too wanted to share that I did have the same conversation in that regard, especially speaking from experience on the other side of the table, that I find it frustrating that when we have to wait for a changeover of the board, it takes the time, precious time away. But we did discuss that, and I understand your reasons, but I did want to note that I shared Mr. Marini's feelings.
Thank you, Ms. Nurse, and go ahead, Mr. Marini.
Yeah, and just to continue, the reason given was that we were endorsed by the HEA. We received no financial backing, and because I was a good candidate, I was told that it would not be appropriate for me to engage in those discussions, but that come January, that would change, which is a curious idea that 6 weeks from now, my beholdenness to the HEA for saying I was a good candidate would then magically disappear. So I am disappointed by this decision, especially since guaranteed 2 of the 4 members having this discussion will absolutely not be on the group come January, which means you could have a 50-50 decision split on steps that were taken up to that point where those 2 new individuals do not agree with the actions of the 2 individuals leaving. So you're leaving the board in a potentially pretty negative position where you have new members come in and completely disagree with the 2 members that were here before and their approach to this discussion. And I think it's in the best interest to give us the best first step forward with the HEA in negotiating these agreements.
So I recognize, Mr. Marini, your points. And to your point about being endorsed by the HEA, I think that in the sense that what difference does 6 weeks make? That's a fair point, except for that NJSBA in their training has often said that perception is reality. And so previously the recommendation, or actually it was a guideline, right? I think the SEC, the School Ethics Commission, there is no preclusion for people who are endorsed. However, the appearance, and so previously the School Ethics Commission had barred candidates who had taken, or not taken, who had been endorsed by the association from participating in negotiations. And so as I made the decision, it was important for me that whatever contract is agreed upon between the board and the association, that it's viewed as fair by the larger Hillsborough community. And I recognize there were, as I've spoken, Ms. Nurse, and to yourself, there were no perfect candidates for the position, because the last election cycle, three board members were endorsed and 3 board members are leaving, which there's just not a lot of choices. So, Ms. Nurse.
I also just wanted to clarify that my intention of saying this today is not because I wanted to be part of that. I'm ineligible to be on the negotiations committee, but, in terms of perception equaling reality, I don't worry about that so much because I just feel we make decisions based on the good of our goals. So I would more concern about who would be on there to make this run smoothly without disruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nurse. Mr. Marini.
Yeah, and in turn, the individuals of Hillsborough voted for us to participate in such activities. So I think the decision on who's on the board and who's capable of having those discussions was something that was overwhelmingly voted on in the previous election. And therefore, the non-rule that you're referring to should not be taken into account when selecting this. You should pick the best people that can help drive this negotiation to closure as quick and as painless as possible.
So, Mr. Marini, with all due respect, I did think about what you said. And as board president, my job is to select members of all committees that I think will be the strongest. And in this particular case, we disagree on who those members are. In the new year, if we are still in negotiations, the new board president will then appoint the open seats. Are there any other comments from the board before I open it up to the public? I'll read it. All right, so I will read the statement again. And actually, before I read the statement, just to remind the public who is here that the Board of Education's role is policy planning, appraisal, and communication, and is not involved in the day-to-day operation of the school district. This board meeting is where the board conducts its business in public, and this public comment period is open for you to express yourselves on any topic that you think is of importance to the community and for the board to hear. However, it is not a dialogue. So with that, we very much welcome input from the public. During board meetings, there will be 2 30-minute periods of time that the meeting will be open for public comment, where members of the public are invited to comment, which they may do if they are attending in person. During the second public comment period, members of the public may comment on any school or school district issue that a member of the public feels may be of concern to the residents of the school district as per bylaw 167. Before you state your comment, you'll be asked to provide your name and address. There is a 3-minute time limit on public comment. Please understand that our public forums are not structured as question and answer sessions, but rather are offered as opportunities to share your thoughts with the board. In instances where the board believes there is a misunderstanding or inaccuracy, the board president or superintendent will address the comment. There may be times when a member of the public makes a comment or asks a question about personnel or hiring decisions. Kindly note that the Open Public Meetings Act and the privacy rights of public employees encompassed therein do not permit the board to discuss personnel issues in public session. And if you would line up at the podium if you have a public comment, and please spell your name for the record. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Robin Griffin. My address is 8 Crestwood Avenue. And my comments, I want to talk about the decision to change the fall play to be a non-in-person event. The students were just informed of this, and the play is 2 weeks away from now. They're not able to have appropriate ticket sales. They're not able to prepare properly for this change. We don't even really know what the change entails. Also, you know, parents weren't allowed to help with set building. The kids had to do everything by themselves. There's no explanation as to why this decision was made. And it's the social and emotional health is compromised, of our children is compromised because they are seeing this inequitable treatment towards the theater students. Our district here on Saturday hosted they hosted the Central Jersey Section 2 Championships for gymnastics, where we had 5 outside teams come along with our team, so that 6 teams came to compete in gymnastics indoor with the fans, with an audience, no limits. All fall, we had volleyball, we had, I don't remember what the other, oh, and well, in gymnastics, no limits. masks. So I guess at the minimum, I just don't understand why the students are not allowed to have the play indoors, and why at minimum the parents can't even come to attend the play, and why there's no explanation for the kids as to why this is happening, and how athletes are allowed to have an audience and students in the theater are not.
Thank you, Mrs. Griffin.
Hi, my name is Ellie Verbeist, and I've been teaching, or a teacher at Hillsborough Township Public Schools for 15 years. I love my job and I love working with the students and staff at Triangle School. Every year, teachers are required to take 6 hours of turnkey training. According to the district's help desk site, the turnkey training program is designed to utilize the amazing talent, experience, and innovation of Hillsborough staff members to provide flexible, relevant, and targeted professional development to district peers and colleagues. I went on to read about some of the courses that are offered this year under the Diversity, Equity, and Belongings category. One course is titled Me and White Supremacy, Part 1, White Privilege, and here's the description. Although we don't always recognize or like to think about it, white privilege affects our everyday lives and interactions in and out of the classroom. In this session, you will learn more about what white privilege is and how it has impacted your life experiences personally and professionally. By examining ourselves, we have a better understanding of how to change our behavior. Another course was titled Me and White Supremacy, Part 2, White Fragility. And there was another one titled Understanding Unconscious Bias. This description was, most of us are offended at the thought that we have implicit bias. Most people quite explicitly stand firmly against bias toward anyone. Unfortunately, our explicit thoughts and values do not preclude us from having biases against others that are not part of our group. In this turnkey, participants will gain an understanding of the basics behind how our brain functions, processes information, and how unconscious biases are almost inescapable. And then there was another course titled LGBTQ Safe Zones, Parts 1, 2, and 3. The target audience for these courses, and these are just a few, is any grade level teacher. To be honest, I was shocked at the amount of courses I saw that revolved around these controversial topics. After quite some time, I was able to find 6 courses with a few open spots that covered topics I felt comfortable applying in the classroom. But I'm sure some staff may have to take these courses even if it's not their top choice, because these turnkey trainings are required. As a parent of 3 young children, I would want to know if their teachers were taking courses that covered similar topics like white privilege or unconscious bias. I would also want to know if their teachers were then expected to incorporate these new ideas into their curriculum. A member of the tech team told me that parents are not informed about the content of these courses and that the Board of Ed is not informed about the content either. I'm sure some members are aware of the content, but I think in order to have open lines of communication between the district and community, this information should be made available to the public. To me, these courses sound like they are coming from a politically driven agenda. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Just as a reminder, if we could just spell your name for the record. Oh. Is it? Oh, okay, okay. Thank you.
We're writing it down.
All right, so this will be short. All right, my name is Matthew Callen. Drop my phone. Kallens. I live at 744 Township Line, and I'd also like to address the decision to not allow for a live audience for the play for this coming fall. You know, with the students have spent many hours after school and on weekends rehearsing. The parents have had made sacrifices.
Excuse me, sir, if you would just put your mask back on.
I'm fully vaccinated too.
That's.
Okay, I will put it on, no problem.
Thank you.
The parents have made sacrifices for their children to be able to participate in the performance. There are currently no restrictions on large indoor group activities, save that masks are recommended. If we are allowing live spectators for sports, why are we not going to allow a live audience for the play? This impacts not just the performance, but the entire performing arts department. If they are not allowed to have a live audience, the financial deficit to the department would effectively bankrupt them and thus impact all future performances. I ask that we allow them to have a live audience so that students can perform as intended with a body of parents and loved ones enjoying the performance and supporting their children.
Thank you. Just if we could pause for one moment, we'll move the,
Hi, my name is Christine, Kristine, Gibson, Gibson, 511 Hoagland Court. I just wanted to express, along with others, my disappointment and frustration regarding the recent decision to ban in-person musical performances in the Hillsborough Public Schools. I've been very cautious throughout the pandemic, and until this point, I have felt overall that our schools have been reasonable in their approach to minimizing risk. But this decision makes no sense and is not only unfair to the students and families of musicians, but also detrimental to the entire music program in our schools. I have two daughters involved in the music program, one here at the middle school and one at the high school. Both have thrived in the musical environment, and thankfully, my older daughter just finished a state championship marching band season. This is all thanks to the dedication of the music staff to provide students with the best experience possible in the most difficult of times. My younger daughter, however, has been in band since 5th grade and has never yet performed in a concert. We've been looking forward to her finally being able to perform this year alongside her peers, but it seems now that this will not be a possibility, at least for the foreseeable future. The guidance we received today via email explains that no in-person events will be held and there will instead be a virtual concert. While these pre-recorded virtual concerts done last year were a nice compromise due to the uncertainty of the times, we're now in a very different situation in terms of public health. Our students are back in school. Bands are practicing in person, many students and family members are vaccinated, and people are congregating in public spaces more regularly even than last spring. Tonight's meeting, case in point. Furthermore, this decision is not in line with those made with regard to sports and other activities. The bands at the middle school and high school are already practicing and will continue to practice indoors with proper precautions, including distancing, masking when possible, and the use of bell covers on instruments. I see no reason why these students cannot perform on a stage, as musicians do, if they can perform in a classroom. If the issue is spectators, which I suspect it is, I see how this might pose a different risk, but I'd like to point out the following. Indoor sports, such as high school volleyball, and now I'm hearing gymnastics, have continued to play indoors throughout the fall. Spectators were limited in number, required to wear masks, but were not banned completely. I expect this may continue to be true for other sports. Why can we not allow a limited number of mass spectators for musical events as well? Our gyms and auditoriums are certainly large enough to accommodate even two guests per student, which is far fewer people than are currently crowding into our unmasked cafeterias at the high school and attending our football games with zero social distancing in place. Doing the in-person concerts may mean breaking them up into several smaller performances. For example, maybe the concert band and the wind ensemble at the middle school can perform back-to-back or on separate evenings, allowing smaller performances and a smaller audience. It may mean adjusting the space use, using the high school auditorium or commons, or another space that can accommodate a larger number of guests. But I think we owe it to our music students to be creative and find ways to give them the opportunities that our athletes are already getting. Even more perplexing to me is that the guidance that we received from Arts Ed New Jersey, which was attached to the email about this decision, is in direct contradiction to what the district decided. This document, which was sent via district email, proposed no restrictions on indoor performances, including audience size and that masks are to be worn at all times. Yet we've decided to ban all indoor performances. Our music students are just as important as our athletes. Performances is the heart of what music is all about. Performing on video is not just the same. I fear that making this decision will not only deprive many of our students of a chance to develop a lifelong love of music, but that it's going to have a lasting impact on the high school music program. A number of my daughter's friends at the middle school have already dropped band because of the lack of opportunity to perform. Again, I'm in favor of reasonable precautions for in-person performances, but this complete ban is unfair, nonsensical, and inconsistent with school policies. And I urge the board and superintendent to reconsider. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Susan Irwin, IRWIN. I reside at 13 Highland Drive. Good evening. I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the Hillsborough High School Choir Parent Association, and there'll be two others that are as well. We understand a decision has been made to not allow an in-person performance with a live audience for the upcoming concert, and we are extremely disappointed with this decision. Given that the choir program is part of the curriculum and not an extracurricular activity, and live performances are an integral part of the educational experience, we believe it is important that the students have the opportunity to perform in front of a live audience. For those students who are pursuing an education in music, many of the college music programs ask their applicants to identify their performances as part of their college audition process. So this could potentially impact the applicant when they are compared to other students from other schools. There are currently 6 out of 11 seniors applying to colleges pursuing a career in music. Part of the application process is an audition. Some of these students will be performing live during auditions for the first time in front of an audience since January 2020, which puts them at a disadvantage to students from other schools who've had those opportunities. And we're going to continue with another member.
Hi, my name is Christine Bice, Chrisistine, Bice, B as in boy, I-C-E. And I live at 5 Vanderlip Road in Hillsborough. And I'm continuing what Susan began. Looking at extracurricular activities that have occurred at Hillsborough High School since the pandemic, HHS Theater performed in the spring of 2021 with a limited audience at a time when not all students were eligible to be vaccinated and many adults were in the midst of being vaccinated. In addition, both indoor and outdoor sports have taken place successfully since the fall of 2020 with spectators, but the Hillsborough High School Choir is still being denied the same opportunity. These events include this Saturday's Girls Varsity Gymnastics NJSIAA sectionals meet hosted at Hillsborough High School, where attendance was not limited, nor was social distancing enforced, and I know because I was there. In addition, if we look to surrounding districts, including the neighboring Montgomery and Bridgewater school systems, they are planning for in-person concerts. The CJMEA Region Choir Concert will also have in-person practices and an audience at their concert, while the NJMEA All-State Treble Chorus has planned for the same. In addition, on October 14th, a letter was sent to all New Jersey arts educators, administrators, principals, superintendents, executive county superintendents, school board members, and health officers from Arts Ed New Jersey, the unified voice for arts education in New Jersey. This letter states, and I quote, "Currently, there are no prohibitions on indoor performances for schools." It then continues with recommendations for performances such as social distancing, masks, etc., which we would be happy to comply with. When looking at the CDC guidelines, the CDC states that, and I quote, "School-sponsored sports and extracurricular activities provide students with enrichment opportunities that can help them learn and achieve and support their social, emotional, and mental health. Prevention strategies in these activities remain important and should comply with school day policies and procedures. People who are fully vaccinated can refrain from quarantine following a known exposure if asymptomatic, facilitating continued participation in in-person learning, sports, and extracurricular activities. Students should refrain from these activities when they have symptoms consistent with COVID-19 and should be tested. The CDC never recommends to refrain from having in-person audiences when having performances." Thank you.
Thank you, sorry.
My name is Allison Lanningbeater. I live at 80 Westcott Road. Continuing on what the other two ladies from the choir Parents Association had mentioned, I just want to reiterate a few more points. We realize that COVID has been the reason for eliminating in-person audiences from indoor performances. But when looking at the COVID numbers from mid-June, when the spring musical performed with a limited in-person audience, to now, we continue to be in a moderate COVID activity level, according to the Somerset County Department of Health. And the latest data from today, November 8th, has listed Somerset County as having the highest percentage in the state of fully vaccinated people at just over 72%. More and more people are eligible to be vaccinated, including now children ages 5 to 11, which should further the case that it is safer and growing safer to have in-person audiences for indoor performances, following, of course, all COVID protocols and safety measures. The high school administration has had 18 months. We've all had 18 months of this to figure out a way to let the choir perform for a live audience. The students have missed their spring concert back in 2020, their live holiday concert in 2020, and a live spring concert in 2021. Mrs. Matthews has done an amazing job with virtual performances, but it's time that these students are able to showcase their talents in the way that their peers have been able to do at sporting and other extracurricular activities. In the end, you have to remember that the Hillsborough High School Choir is an academic class, and by denying the students the opportunity to perform live, they're being denied part of their education. The decision of an in-person performance shouldn't be whether to have it, but rather how we can do it safely. And we as parents are willing to work with the administration to come up with an acceptable solution. Please reconsider. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Good evening. My name is Kelly Irwin, Kellyyirwin, and I live at 13 Highland Drive. I'm a senior at Hillsborough High School, and I'm the department manager of our student-led choir council. I have been a member of HHS choirs since my freshman year, and I'm currently auditioning and applying for music education programs at colleges as I hope to become a music educator. As a student, I would like to provide perspective on what a performance that is in person means to me. When I walked on stage, I could feel that nervous energy and excitement as I peeked to see who was there to watch. I would make a mistake in the craziness of nerves, but I would compose myself and keep going. This ability to persevere while singing is important. Unfortunately, we have been unable to have an in-person concert since our last concert in January 2020. As a student auditioning live for colleges in the winter, this experience with the pressure of an audience is vital to my success at an audition. Other students from other districts will be put at an advantage and be given spots in a program because they have this experience, and have practiced perseverance, which is unfair to me and my peers. Additionally, performances are a part of our core curriculum, but how can we be following this curriculum if we are unable to perform for an actual audience? We are not an extracurricular program. We are a class who has worked hard to be able to showcase our hard work and talents. Furthermore, we as performers feed off of the excitement and energy in the audience. This is what creates an interactive and impactful performance. Not only are the performers impacted by this experience, but with a live audience, those in the audience can also be affected. Sometimes the strong emotions performed cannot travel through a screen, but they can impact someone sitting at the back row who feels the raw and pure emotions that music can communicate. As students emerging from a difficult almost 2 years and dealing with a pandemic, music is something that connects us. It is an essential part of who we are. Performances help us navigate the audition anxiety and performance anxiety,
and it allows everyone to set reasonable goals for themselves and the choir itself, which is an important aspect of social emotional learning. Arts Ed NJ, who we have been following for advice in our musical department, has even stated that there are no limitations related to indoor performances at schools. If we continue to ban in-person performances, we are taking away these experiences for the musicians and the audience members. If we continue, when will this community ever perform? We need to keep the arts living, and we cannot do this if we are confined to recording after recording. Music is more than sounding pretty. It is about communicating a message and creating a meaningful and impactful performance for an audience and the performers. I urge you to reconsider and allow for HHS Choir and all the other performing groups to have their concerts and performances in person. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
My name is Amy McLaughlin, A-M-Y-M-C, capital L-A-U-G-H-L-I-N, and I live at 2205 Jamestown Common. Most people have a really strong reaction to getting up in front of a crowd. For some people, it's abject terror, but for others, it's the best experience of their life. Performers crave the audience response. Performing in front of an audience is a critical part of the music curriculum at HHS, and the kids need an opportunity to practice that. Last spring and over the summer, there were in-person performances allowed. Why are we going backwards? The Fall Play Funds help to support the spring musical. And if they're not allowed to have an in-person audience, there will not be ticket sales to support that. Is the board prepared to replace those funds to allow the spring musical to happen? We're allowing academic and sporting teams to join in person. Why are we not allowing our musical students the experience of having an audience? The kids have missed so much during COVID, and I do applaud the superintendent and the Board of Ed for how far we came. My kids are certainly really happy to be back at school, and choir has been a haven for my daughter, who's a freshman. We are pleased that you're willing to reassess ongoing, but it's not going to be soon enough for some of the key events in the fall if we wait till January. More people are vaccinated, and it's really an environment, we're willing to be masked, social distance. We're just asking for you to give us an opportunity to see our kids perform. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Hi, my name is Rosa Sowers, and I live at 69 Meadowbrook Drive, and I spell my name R-O-S-A, last name S-A-U-E-R-S, and I have a daughter who's a freshman at Hillsborough High School in the theater program, and we have recently learned that there will not be a live audience for their performance of Puffs, and this is extremely disappointing to both the kids as well as their families who are looking forward to seeing their hard work. For some, this will be their last high school performance. Live audiences have always been important to the theater for many reasons, especially now when both kids and parents have suffered isolation and depression. The actors feed off their audience and their enthusiasm. And it's not just the same performing without an audience. It is my understanding that sports, such as gymnastics, volleyball, etc., are allowed to have spectators both inside and out. There is no social distancing or a reduction in the amount of people allowed into these events. How do we explain this to our theater kids? What is the rationale for discriminating against theater in favor of other events? Last year's musical was allowed in person with a reduced audience. How was it determined that this was less safe now then more people are vaccinated and they have a clearer understanding of the facts that masks save lives. We are gathered here tonight in a room full of people. How is it that this is allowed, but families may not gather safely to see their children perform? These kids worked incredibly hard and devoted many hours. Other districts are having their shows without restrictions other than masks. The arts bring people together, and that is their purpose. Although it can be argued that they are not less important than this meeting or than sports, I will even venture to go a step further. I will suggest that they may be more important. The arts give a voice to many who wouldn't otherwise have one. We hope you reconsider your decision and allow these kids a chance to perform for their family and friends. It is just the right thing to do, and I appreciate your time and consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sellers.
Good evening. My name is Joe Trabulski, a resident of Hillsborough at 36 Fox Chase Run, but I'm also the principal of Hillsborough Middle School, and I rise tonight as well as the president of the Hillsborough Principals and Supervisors Association. Before I speak to this issue, I would be remiss if I didn't also lend my voice of support for the comments that have been shared this evening with regard to performances and our kids who are in the performing arts. And I certainly welcome additional dialogue about that issue and how we might be able to address some of the points and concerns raised tonight. But I rise tonight in all these capacities as a resident, principal, and president of the Principals and Supervisors Association, as I am deeply troubled this evening by an action that took place under a directive that, is my understanding, was made by a member of this Board of Education to censor a display in the commons of the Hillsborough Middle School. A display of African-American cultural and historical pieces, literature, and African-American icons in the arts, athletics, academics, and community service that also included elements of social justice and social injustice in our American history with regard to African Americans, from slavery through the civil rights movement to contemporary issues around policing, equity, and justice. This display that included bulletin boards and 3 showcases was created in collaboration with our school librarian and our student organization, HMS Cares, that is the Club for Anti-Racism and Equity in Schools, whose students, you may recall, spoke eloquently at the board last spring about the importance of this board committing itself to ensuring educational equity for our students of color, and whose faculty advisors spoke eloquently at the New Jersey Department of Education's Equity in Action Conference this summer about their very work. This display included an element with a point of view around the very real issue of policing practices, social justice, and equity in America. And that image was censored today and removed over my objections. Now, let me be clear. I hold in the highest regard the brave, professional, and dedicated members of our community that serve nobly and honorably in law enforcement here in Hillsborough and across our country. But no one, not public officials, educators, or the police, regardless of how high our esteem may be, are above criticism. Criticism that is raised within appropriate educational contexts in civil discourse and academic settings, even where it may be provocative or controversial. It is abhorrent to me that any public official, including a member of this Board of Education, if you'll indulge me, would use his or her authority to advance an agenda in censoring the views of others in an academic or any other setting. What happened today, if you will, dishonored the work of those who defend our communities and our Constitution. What happened today was an affront to critical thinking, academic freedom, and the freedom of expression of our young people. You opened this meeting, as I do every day, pledging allegiance to preserve the rights of liberty and justice for all, and I remind students all the time of the awesome responsibility they have to that pledge for themselves and others. Tonight, I rise to publicly condemn this act of censorship that was perpetuated today and the removal of this image in the context of that larger display. that served only to challenge our thinking around policing in America. And I call on the board to recommit itself to preserving academic integrity and the free and critical expression of ideas, and most importantly of all, to listen to the voices of those raising concerns for social justice and in opposition to those who would seek to silence them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Trabolski.
Good evening. Henry Goodhue, 16 Laurel Drive, Hillsborough Education Association. Be a bit all over the place with a couple of the things to address. The comments made by Ms. Stats were on point and necessary. I think, the board is discussing many things. We've heard you talk about budgets, and over the last couple of meetings, we've repeatedly heard about class sizes and the fact that in many instances we're over. We have not heard you talk about the fact that at almost every board meeting now, for at least 3 of them, we've lost at least 1 special ed teacher. And we haven't questioned why our special ed teachers are leaving, or why any of our teachers are leaving for that matter. We also haven't discussed the fact that surrounding districts are increasing their substitute rates, and ours remain flat where they are. And yet we bemoan the fact that there's an inability to have coverage. So districts are doing little our district is doing little to address these needs, not realizing that perhaps some of them are connected. We're losing people because they're stressed out. We're losing people because of the lack of coverage, because of what's happening on a daily basis there. Yet the conversations are not going to that place. So I urge the board to reconsider any conversations that they're having regarding budgets, and take a look at the current budget and any prospective ones, and think about how we can fully fill every staffing position that's necessary, as well as allocate for the ones that are needed. I also would like to lend my support to what the students and many parents brought up tonight. I think, I'm not going to reiterate what they said. Those points were made far better than I could make them. What I will say is that this district, this board, our staff, has done a good job finding balance. We've stayed open when other districts have had to close buildings. We've found ways to allow students to start returning to some degree of normal. We've found ways to provide some degree of equity in those decisions, as evidenced by the actions you took tonight with academic teams. So I know that we can find some way to make things work, and I would urge you to please do the same for this. I think working together, we could find a way to allow students to perform, as well as keep everybody safe, which is one of my primary goals, and I know is yours as well. And I had no intention of speaking on this, but being that I'm following Dr. Trabolski, I find it absolutely disturbing if any member of an elected position, especially a board, which is apolitical, exerts their personal beliefs to influence or administrate the board. And if that is in fact true, then I hope the appropriate recourse as ascribed by the NJSBA will be followed, and that will be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodhue.
Hi, my name's Dina Albanese, DINA-ALBANESE. My address is 328 Zion Road. I don't have anything written down, and I will be short and sweet. I'm here to show my support for the performing arts. My daughter is a junior. She's in theater. She's in choir, heavily involved. You mentioned earlier, I wasn't even going to speak, but a few things popped into my head when you were saying earlier, perception is truth. Right now, I can't speak for all of the performing arts students, but I know my daughter and a few of her friends who I've spoken to, the perception is that there's bias against them, or that they're not cared about, because they see, as again, everybody else said, the sports are allowed to have people there. Even the football games, it's outside, but they're shoulder to shoulder, they're packed in there. And I just want to reiterate again, my daughter's looking to pursue a career in theater. It's making it very hard. COVID hit her freshman year, the end of her freshman year, and it's still kind of ongoing. She's junior now. They need those live performances. they are being somewhat, missing part of their academics in that area. So I'm just here to show my support. I know you guys are doing your best to keep our students safe, so I just want to make sure you know that I appreciate that, and I know a lot of the parents do. Just hope you'll reconsider and we can figure out a way to social distance like we did in June. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Albanese. Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, then I will close public comment and turn it over to the board for any comments. Mr. Gillette, and then Ms. Nurse.
Thank you. I had a couple of things I wanted to say. First, on the performing arts, live performances. So I'm not going to, let me put it this way. That the decisions on that are totally in the purview of the superintendent, but I did have a comment to make about it. I know in some school districts, given enough time for like something like a school play, they're able to use some type of service to like sell tickets for streaming, but I don't think there's even enough time to do that at this point. So that's what's disappointing to me, that that there may not be enough time even for them to do like sell tickets through a streaming service and do something. So that was disappointing to me. The other thing I wanted to mention was on the teacher that spoke about the turnkey training. I know for a fact that her views, she's not the only one with those views. She's not the only teacher with those views. I think it's kind of courageous actually for her to come up and speak here tonight. And yes, the board doesn't know the content of the training, but I have to say it because it's true. Back in April, in the weeks, or maybe in the week leading up to the budget vote, I did specifically ask administration if training of this type would be budgeted for and be provided to teachers this year, and I was told no, training of this type would not be provided. So there you go. That's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gillette. Ms. Nurse?
I too know that the decisions about live performances is in the hands of the administration here, but I do have an opinion on it. I have always been conservative in terms of safety. I think that is our number one priority, but we are living in safer times. We're opening up more, and to have certain events that allow for indoor spectators and not others is very bothersome to me, especially when we have kids with all different passions. I really think we do have time to reconsider and do something that keeps everybody safe but allows for live performances. So I hope that administration can talk about that very soon. In terms of the turnkey courses, like Mr. Gillette said, we do not know the specifics on that, but I would ask that if, being a teacher in a neighboring district, I know how hard it is sometimes classes close, and if this is mandatory training, but we are putting staff in a position where they're not comfortable taking certain classes, that is problematic. So I'm hoping that there's an avenue for those staff members to reach out to someone in administration and have them do something else in lieu of that, or raise the limitations of other classes to help everybody feel valued and their feelings regarding this. We do not want to put, or I do not want to put anybody in an uncomfortable position. And the whole issue about what was censored at the middle school is news to myself and probably a lot of the board members. So if there is a way to get an explanation about what exactly happened or what was censored, that would be great. If not tonight, if we get an email in that regard, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nurse. Ms. Fofana, then Mr. Oliver, then Ms. Stats.
So I understand that I'm looking at a lot of these issues from a student's perspective. And I know that there was a comment made about controversial subject matters, but I think, again, like I had mentioned at our last meeting, that these programs were only established to better our education, and also that the fact that they are uncomfortable shows why they're so imperative, that they're fundamental to the understanding of these teachers. And once those teachers have a firm grasp on these issues, then they're able to foster a positive and more inclusive environment for themselves and for students. And additionally, I just wanted to talk about in-person performances, and that it is very important to consider that students pursuing musical careers are detrimentally impacted by this lack of opportunity. And I think allowing in-person performances is just the one, I guess, sense of normalcy that a lot of us are allowed to have this year. I'm not a member of choir or, a live and in-person performing extracurricular, but I do see that universally we prioritize athletes over other activities at our school. So I just think that's something to take into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fafana. Mr. Oliver?
So I'm going to try to keep my comments brief tonight, but that's going to be a little hard to do. So, I know the last meeting was several weeks ago, and we had a lot of parents came in and spoke to us about academics not being able to travel. It was the first time the board was aware of it. We received some emails about it. We asked that the education committee look at it. We looked at it. We made a decision. They're now allowed to travel. Busing is a continued problem. We have a lot of issues with busing, parent waivers. We're going to try to figure it out. I lost count, 10, 11, 12, 13 people came up and talked about performing plays, choir. First we heard of it with some emails. I'm hoping the administration can take a good hard look at that, come back with a good solid answer and accommodate, because it is very, very important. It can't be a lot of fun. I'm not a singer. I could tell a couple of jokes now and again, but telling it to a TV screen or a computer screen is a lot different than a live audience. So I'm hoping we could quickly pivot and look into something like that. I want to thank the Triangle School teacher. Mr. Gillette and I have talked a lot about critical race theory. We've had parents come in and talk about what's being taught in the class. We're told it's not being taught in the class, but it keeps popping up its ugly head. But the last subject, and full disclosure, I am the board member about the poster that was in the middle school. So full disclosure, John Oliver, I am the board member. So I was given that from several individuals in town that found it inflammatory. And when I saw a picture of it, taking out of context that one little snippet, I also found it inflammatory. So as a board member and an elected official, I asked the administration, what is this about? And they were going to look into it. So I have no problem with expressing views. I have my own personal views, as everyone else out here has their own personal views. We're not allowed to have them portrayed out at a board meeting, right? We need to be independent. But there's a fine young gentleman sitting there in the corner with a badge on and a gun at his side who puts his life on the line for us every single shift. There should be, and I hope there is, in that display case, a counterpoint to show his dedication and his commitment to the job to keeping us safe. I don't know the answers to that. I'm still waiting for answers to that. So if that was taken down, that wasn't because of this one little board member's objection that found it inflammatory. I just wanted some answers. So we need to go back and we need to look at what we're doing and how we're portraying things. Because to your point, as educators, as elected officials, as board members, as police officers, we need to look at both sides. We don't need to give a view, we need to give both opposing views, and let our young students, let our children make their own decisions for themselves. So I find it very disturbing that someone feels that they were censored from this one little individual board member. I wanted some answers, and I'm hoping we'll get some answers, and I've asked this to be discussed in more detail tomorrow at our HR meeting, and hopefully, Dr. Trabowski, you'll get some better answers on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Ms. Stats?
Well, first of all, what Ray said, you're amazing. There are some things I'm not going to bother saying because you said it so much better than I can. But full disclosure, I've been a volunteer artist for HHS theater program for several years, including this year for Puffs. I understand everybody's concerns, and I really admire and respect Dr. Antunez's concern for safety. That is the highest regard regarding everything for the past almost 2 years. But as far as in-person performances, it really makes a huge difference, especially with comedy, and that's what Puffs is, a comedy, you know, hearing the laughter, applause, and applause for any kind of performance, in-person performance, which is a big part of learning, even not just for the ones who are comfortable performing live, but especially for those who are uncomfortable having that experience with a live audience. But the auditorium, I think, does lend itself to an excellent opportunity to enforce distancing. But as Dr. Antunez said earlier, she is open to reevaluating it, and she has been flexible, as you can see with the recent decision regarding academic teams. So I'm confident that she will continue to reevaluate this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stentz. Ms. Nurse?
I just wanted to say specifically to Mr. Oliver, thank you very much for clarifying at the middle school. And I think you just really had a fine example of our perception is reality discussion, because this was very unrealistic that it was censored and brought down because of one single board member. So thank you for taking ownership and explaining to everybody. You know, and I think it just speaks to your integrity about being honest and communicating. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Nurse. Ms. Fofana?
I'm not trying to scrutinize anyone, but in regards to what took place in the middle school, I think that from my understanding, the showcase was a form of representation and not inherently controversial. And I understand, you know, the importance of allowing students to have their own opinion and not be biased because there's only one side being on display. But I think that in regards specifically to African American accomplishments and culture, that I think we have to look like as a community how we define what's inflammatory and what's simply just foreign to people based on their own personal experience. And I do understand that, you know, some of these topics are inherently controversial, but I think as far as diversity and inclusivity, those things are just necessary and vital to our school community. So I think that's something to consider.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gillette?
Yes, so let me just say, I don't think, thank you, John, for speaking about the item at the middle school, but I don't think the point of it was that you were following up on a concern that you received from a constituent, and you followed the procedure, you went to the superintendent about it and asked some questions about it. And that's basically it. And I would have done the same thing if not knowing anything about it, go to the superintendent, and I don't think the superintendent was aware, not the superintendent is aware of every display in every library, and superintendent, she did not have an immediate answer. I wouldn't expect her to. She's not aware of every display, but she went out to find some information about it. So thank you for putting the facts out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gillette. Mr. Oliver?
And I mean, I appreciate the support. I'm not looking to hide behind anything. I'm the one that saw it. I got it from some constituents and made an inquiry. We had a little bit of a robust and maybe comical at times discussion about this at governance committee. And again, we came up with the conclusion that somebody may have taken this picture and took it out of context, right? So it could have been just taking out of that one example, could have been taken out of context. If we were studying World War II there may be a snippet of something in World War II that could be taken out of context that's part of a much bigger display. So it was just simply an inquiry. What context was it portrayed in, and why it was there? Was it part of a study program? What was the message? And if there was a message, was there a message from both sides to make, again, the students have their own bias, their own determination of what they thought was a racial inequality or a racial equality? Just an inquiry, that's all it was. And I'm still waiting to hear, and we will get to the bottom of it. We're going to discuss it again, but we'll get an explanation on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver and Mr. Gillette.
And this is my last comment. I'm just, in part of that inquiry, I think we should find out why the middle school principal was informed that a board member censored his school project. How did that happen? So I'd like to find out that answer to that question too.
Thank you, Mr. Gillette. Ms. Stats?
Actually, I think you're making a good point. It almost, I feel that it could be possible for board members to be less inclined to speak up about any kind of concern they might have in fear of being thrown under the bus, when in fact, no board members were part of the decision regarding any action taken regarding all or part of any display.
Thank you, Ms. Stats.
And I'll just make one last final comment. I could assure you, it will never stop me from speaking my mind and bringing up those points. So, and I appreciate that, but it is a very good point. Maybe some other board members or some individuals may feel stifled by it. Please don't feel stifled by it. Bring it to our attention. I am so glad that everybody came here tonight and talked about choir, because it gives us an opportunity to look into it and try to help, try to remedy it. And again, we'll look at those things, but I appreciate everyone's comments tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Mr. Kidd?
I assume we're going to have an update about what's going on in the middle school. I still am a little unsure about some specifics, so I'm looking forward to an update, either an email or some other private, or another private update to board members. But separately, regarding choir performances, if it is possible to safely administer performances this fall with an audience at any level, I strongly urge the administration to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Kidd. Mr. Marini?
I just want to make sure everyone else is done with that topic before I change. Good? Okay. Just a comment, for anybody who may think we don't have one of the greatest districts out there, week in and week out, we do get students that come up and speak at the podium, and they are perhaps the best speakers of everybody in the room. So I just want to thank the students that come up and speak their piece. They do it better than I do. And for any of those students listening, feel free, keep coming to these meetings, represent yourself, because you'd be very proud of how you've developed and how you present yourself at these meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Marini. Are there any other comments from the board? Okay, if not, then I have just a few comments that I wanted to let the public know, because this conversation that we've had is very, very nice and very robust conversation. At 6 o'clock earlier this evening, which was live streamed, the board had training from NJSBA actually on inherent, implicit, unconscious bias, and I believe the subtitle was "What We Think We Don't Think We Think," something like that, and so it was by Vincent DeLucia. And so if you're so inclined, it is available on Hillsborough's YouTube channel. And then I also wanted to remind the public, and also thank the students and the parents, community members who spoke about the performance. And as I think Ms. Stats had said, with respect to the superintendent is doing, her number one priority is to keep schools open. And I think that we've seen it's November 9th. And we have been in school full-time, 5 days a week, as a community had asked for, right? That we had planned all summer for. And so I understand the frustration with the inconsistencies or the seeming inconsistencies with athletics versus performance arts. I do, and I think we've heard the board does also. And I think that with all things COVID, there's a lot of inconsistencies. I think Dr. Antunes even acknowledged that in her superintendent's report. And so the superintendent has, and we've all heard how important it is. And I think we already knew how important it is. So we absolutely appreciate you coming out tonight to express yourselves. I'm confident that the administration will get further details about the logistics and see if it is possible. No guarantees, right, and no promises, but Dr. Antunes has been true to her word that she would reconsider. And so I'm confident that she will. Hopefully we'll have good news soon, but as I said, no promises. Seeing no other board comments, then I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you very much. We'll see you in 2 weeks.